From Hamilton Place Strategies in Washington, D.C., this is the HPS Insights podcast.
Welcome to HPS Insights, a podcast from Hamilton Place Strategies about events impacting business and politics. I'm your host, Tucker Warren. Today, I'm joined by Eric Schulze, Vice President of Product and Regulation at Memphis Meats. We're excited to have Eric on to talk about cell-based meat products, their disruption to the traditional meat market, and the regulatory processes behind bringing a cell-based product to market in the United States. Eric, welcome.
Thanks for having me. It's great to be here.
Why don't we start off? Tell us a little bit about yourself. How did you find yourself at a food technology manufacturer?
What a long and sordid tale, but I'll be quick about it. I used to be a federal regulator for the United States Food and Drug Administration, where I worked on novel food and drug policies for new biotechnology. So, in short, I was regulating genetically engineered animals that were intended to be used for food or drugs. By training, I'm a professional scientist, and I have a PhD in genetic, molecular, and cellular biology, and I was working in genetic engineering and working on biotherapeutic production. The FDA came knocking, and I decided that I believed that science could also have the greatest good if I went and worked for the government. So long story short, ended up at the FDA doing work for 6 years in the Obama administration. Really, really loved doing federal service and civil service, and I think it's something every scientist should do. And as I was doing it, I was coming across amazing technologies that were coming through and realizing that some of these companies really knew what they were doing and a lot of them didn't. They had incredible ideas, but fell sort of at the wayside when faced with considerable federal regulation, especially if it was new. So what I realized is, well, I wanted to continue doing what I think of as public service in the private sector. And I wanted to help a company I could believe in that was doing something interesting and meaningful for society. And that's how I came across Memphis Meats. And when I did, I applied and immediately connected with Dr. Uma Valetti, our CEO and co-founder, and Dr. Nick Genovese, our Chief Scientific Officer. And we hit it off. And, within a few months, I was out in the San Francisco Bay Area working at a startup.
Why don't you give our listeners a brief history of Memphis Meats, maybe even among the things, what's in the name Memphis Meats? I'm a Tennessean, so I know that good barbecue certainly hails from the great state of Tennessee, but what's behind the name and what prompted Uma to start the company?
Yeah, so Uma, our CEO, founded the company in 2015. Mainly out of a lifelong passion and desire to solve an itch in his brain that he'd been thinking about for years. He grew up as a lifelong meat eater in India. His family used meat to celebrate lots of occasions. And as he tells you, that it was really important culturally for him and his family and his community. But he learned as he sort of got older and older, realizing, because he's from a very educated family, that maybe there's a different way to get the same meat to the table. And he said, as he tells you, like researching this, it's not a new idea to produce meat outside of the animal. This is an old idea. What was lacking is sort of the technology and infrastructure to do it. And so he ends up being a medical doctor for the Mayo Clinic in Minnesota, and where he and his family lived. And he decided to finally do it. He had been thinking about it for years, and he went and sourced and found Nick, our Chief Scientific Officer, and realized that they shared the same passions for producing meat, and decided that what if we could really do this? And so the central thought that they needed in order to form the company was, can you grow muscle tissue, the part of the animal that we typically assume is meat, outside of the animal? And the answer is yes. The question is how, and how do you do it cost effectively? Academic labs have been doing this for years. Tissue engineers have been doing this for years, but very small scale. And in 2011, if you remember, Mark Post of the Netherlands debuted the first cell-based hamburger. And that was a very expensive hamburger. And so also all of this together gave them the idea that what if we just developed a commercial entity to do this? Just dedicatedly try to put this out in market as a consumer product and sort of skip the whole academic exercise. So he left his job as a professor and as a medical doctor, came out here, founded a company, and that gets to why it's called Memphis Meats in 2015. And long story short is, interestingly, it came from the ancient city of Memphis in Egypt. So not even Memphis, Tennessee. That's happenstance, actually. We like to retcon that in. I wish I could say it's because of the barbecue is so great, but the alliteration also is fantastically coincidental. But bottom line, Uma really loved the idea of this ancient city of Memphis in Egypt as this wonderful cultural hub, and he'd always admired it from that standpoint, and thought that this could be a way to bring people together. Now, of course, it just makes sense to associate it with barbecue, which is what I do, and that's what I thought when I joined as well.
Well, so we've seen the rise of plant-based alternatives in recent years. Pretty significant growth there, like the Impossible Burger and others. But this is fundamentally different, isn't it? And can you talk a little bit about how and whether the trajectory of plant-based alternatives is part of what might make investors and others optimistic about the future of Memphis Meats too?
Yeah, there's clearly the sort of two things at play, I think, that sort of fundamentally go on in terms of, with consumers and what they want to buy. And Tucker, you probably know a lot more about this than even I would as a professional scientist, but this notion that consumers love choice and they love things to, in the case of food, taste good and be affordable. And I think underneath that, sort of the presumption is that it's safe, and we can get to that later if you'd like. But if they like the options that they have in front of them and they can afford it and it fits within their lifestyle, in theory, they're going to buy it. So I think for the plant-based alternatives, there's a lot of people who choose to abstain from the consumption of meat from an animal, and plant-based alternatives give them that option. And the technology to produce those is increasing every year. You can see that with Beyond Meat and Impossible Burgers. What we're doing is fundamentally different, because at the end of the day, we are producing actual animal tissue. This is not a plant-based product. It is actual muscle tissue, actual connective tissue, actual fat from an animal cells directly made from their cells. So it is actual real meat. And then we process it just like real meat products. So it's not trying to emulate meat. It is meat.
What about there's a lot of science, of course, that goes into food, and that's historically the case. It sounds like there's, of course, a lot of science in a Memphis Meats product. Is that something that you think consumers have expressed or will express any concern about? Or, of course, you're a scientist, so I'm guessing you're going to tell me about all of the science that's in every single thing that that Memphis Meats is no more or less scientific than Cheerios.
Tucker, you're doing my job for me. So you're absolutely correct. I think people want to know how their food is made. But at the same time, if you ask them how their food is made, a lot of people couldn't tell you that. And that's not a knock against the consumer. It's just, people are trying to get through their day. They just want to put food on the table and they want it to taste good and they want it to be safe. I totally understand that. Sure, there's an incredible amount of research and development that goes into producing our products. Because as you can imagine, obviously we're trying to sidestep the entirety of the animal. And I wonder if it, might make sense just to take a step back and see how we actually produce these products. Just for a second. In order to produce cell-based meat, we take, animal cells from an animal. So in this case, muscle stem cells. We take like a small biopsy from that animal, and it could be a living or an animal that's intended for slaughter. So in this case, maybe let's take a cow. We take it from its muscles. We take those cells back to our facility, and then we put them in an environment that's clean. There's no bacteria growing in. It's just the muscle cells, and then we feed it the same fundamental things that an animal would need, sugars, amino acids, proteins, vitamins and minerals and water and oxygen. And we, give it a warm environment to grow. And those cells will continue growing because they don't know they're no longer inside of an animal. They are just programmed to produce more muscle. So for a much shorter period than it would be in an animal, in the case of a cow, it's about 18 months to grow to maturity. In their case, it's just 14 days or so. We have an considerable amount of muscle tissue that we then harvest, and then we process it just like any meat product you would buy. So hamburgers, patties, those sorts of things, meatloaves, whatever. And then you can eat it. So the whole point of what we're doing is bypassing the growth of the animal is what we're doing, and in producing the direct muscle product. So in this case, this might appeal to people because of the science that's involved in producing that. Or in some cases, people just want to eat a delicious product. So in this case, we just want to be able to put the same thing that they know right in front of them. So if they want a hamburger, we just want that hamburger to taste incredible. And hopefully they buy it on that merit alone.
Well, there might be, and you've touched on some, there are many reasons why people choose to not eat meat. Some of those are environmental, some of them are cultural, some of them are humanitarian. But it strikes me based on what you just said that Memphis Meats might appeal to any number of those buckets for people. If you're taking this out of the cow, and we know that cows are considerable contributors to methane in our environment, that this could be changing that paradigm significantly.
Yeah. And Memphis Meats too, like we have this philosophy. It's a part of our mission. It's called the big tent. And it's this idea that everyone's welcome under it, that comes in good faith, that wants to solve the largest problem we have, which is, and one of them is climate change. And of course, is on top of that, feeding a growing population and increasing demand of meat. So by 2050, we're expecting the population to be about 10 billion people from about 7.4 billion today. And meat demand is expected to double in that time. So how do we feed all those people? How do we do it with limited resources? The planet's not getting bigger. We haven't colonized another planet yet. But the notion of feeding people and doing it in a responsible way is also what motivates us. So if you have an environment, if you want to eat meat, but you don't want the impacts of the environment, then we think that cell-based meat's a great option. If you are an ethical vegan and you choose to abstain from meat for that reason, then obviously we think that this also meets that bar for you. And of course, if you just love eating meat, like myself, I'm a meat eater. I want to keep eating it. And I just want to eat delicious meat products. And this is another opportunity for me to do so while also, helping the environment if I can. The most important thing is that I'm not here to tell you, and we're not here to tell you like what to do or why to do it. We want to provide consumers with a choice, with a great product that on its own merits is a great meat product.
And so I think that one's going to connect with our meat eater listeners, which I'd consider myself that. I love a good aged, well marbled steak. What's there to be excited about on that score? I'm guessing that there's a whole lot you can do as that muscle tissue develops to ensure that that final product is as buttery as the finest, well marbled Wagyu steak.
Listen, I want A5 Kobe as bad as anyone else. And so I'm head of product design for this company. So on top of the regulatory affairs, I also help lead the teams that design the actual finished food product. And for better or worse, it's being calibrated to me and my team's palates. I really want this product to be delicious on its own merit, as I said before. So what's important there is that, and also level setting of like what we can and can't do at the moment. Our goal is to do exactly what you're saying, Tucker. It's like make that well marbled, like 45 day aged like steak. We're not there yet. We think that that's possible for this industry, but right now we're trying to produce familiar favorites that have potentially some degree of processing. But like we're eventually trying to get to the steak on the plate. The goal for Memphis Meats though is to have center plate products. Like when you eat and meat is part of that meal, it's right in front of you. It's not hidden in something else. But there are now, Memphis Meats was the first company ever in this space in 2015. And since then, there's over 60 companies worldwide in 4 short years. Yeah. And every product under the sun is being, attempted basically. And it just goes to show you how large the meat market is in terms of addressability. There's no shortage of white space for a cell-based meat company to address in terms of the meat products that could be produced.
I want to go back just for a minute on the environment because, as we know, cows are a significant contributor, and of course they take up a lot of space and they need a lot of water. So if you still need a cow from which, or another animal from which to extract the cells. So it's not as if you don't need any, but I'm guessing this significantly reduces the number of cows you need, thus the amount of space you need, thus water consumption. Can you take us through that process a little bit?
Yeah, I mean, you've hit on it. More or less the conceptual aspect of this is correct. It's this notion that sure, we need an animal as the starting material, absolutely. But once we get those cells, in theory, we're able to use those for years and years, and the production volume from that one single biopsy is on the order of thousands of cows in the case of a cow, for example. So what it does, even if we're taking it from an animal that's intended for slaughter, and the reason we do so is because we can guarantee the food safety of that animal through like USDA regulation, is because it can also potentially reduce future slaughter volume as well of those particular animals. So, but even in that case, the market for meat is so large. Even at a 1% stake in the market, it's still such a large market cap at that point for us that we again see ourselves as sort of an and not an or solution in this particular instance. So it's easy to jump to the conclusion that our entire goal is to just immediately replace or displace conventional animal agriculture, which is not the case. We see ourselves as adding on to the existing infrastructure, and again, for the merits of our products alone, hoping consumers buy them.
Does this process change the ability to scale, given that you're presumably able to do what you just described with more limited space, not just the space that you would need for the cows, but just in processing, to your point earlier, so we think about a population at 2050 that's both exploding in numbers and having a more Western oriented diet, which as defined means more meat. Is this concept something that can mean more meat available globally, and that physical structures can be smaller to accomplish those numbers?
So yes, producing cell-based meat is expected to use considerably less like land area and resources. We're not yet at commercial scale or on market, so we're waiting to collect those data so that we can affirmatively say those things backed up with evidence in, for example, like a life cycle assessment of the environmental impacts. But at current levels, we're building our pilot plant as we speak right now. Without the need to actually house animals, we can imagine the size is comparable. Instead of a feedlot, you're thinking more of like a microbrewery sized facility, like producing wine or beer and producing a comparable amount of meat. But again, it takes a lot of space still to produce it. That's not trivial itself, but we can place those small facilities in theory in a lot more places around the world, as you suggested, and then using animals from that area too. So using cells to produce meats from, like, say there's a particular like Schulze or like a Piedmontese type of cow in Italy or something that people want to that are accustomed to eating. We can produce cell-based meat from that particular animal from that region, a sort of terroir, if you will, of meat that isn't trivial. But yes, lower footprint. We're expecting it to be lower environmental impact, lower greenhouse gas emissions, and sort of mitigating as we can and do our part to help mitigate climate change, but still giving people what they want to eat, in this case, delicious meat.
So let's talk a little bit about this going to market. I'm in Washington, D.C., and you spent a considerable amount of time here, including at the FDA. So I assume the FDA is the regulatory authority over your product, and what does the process look like of introducing a new product like cell-based meat that the FDA might look at and think that it's fundamentally different than anything else it's regulating, but that at a scientific level you would look at and say it is not different, it's just the process of getting there is different, but the final product is not?
Yeah, you got it. So I like to think of cell-based meat is a very mundane product produced in an extraordinary way. And when you think of it from that perspective, the regulatory aspects make a lot more sense. And yes, now we're moving into regulatory arena, which is everyone's favorite topic. Let's talk about federal regulation of food products. But I cannot overstate how important the food safety aspect of these products will be for the long-term survival of this industry. At Memphis Meats, we placed a priority on it from like day one. Is also a pillar of the company and an investment in us is that food safety and establishing the safety of these products is going to be key to consumer buy-in, that the FDA and USDA have signed off on this. And to your point, who regulates these? In this case, we worked with the US government to establish that the FDA will evaluate the safety of these products, which is what it does for any new food, and is appropriate for that. And then USDA regulates all meat and poultry in this country, and its processing, inspection, and labeling. And in this case, they'll be doing that as well. It gets a little more nuancy in that FDA typically has a lot of experience evaluating, mammalian culture systems. So this idea of being able to evaluate any risks or the safety of how we grow the cells, the process, FDA is much better at doing that. But that's not to say USDA isn't good at it. USDA just has a strength in analyzing the safety of meat food processing. So our pilot facility will have a USDA regulated component and an FDA regulated component. And then we can talk about the safety of these products if you'd like, specifically how they'd be established. But broadly speaking, FDA will establish safety and USDA will do the inspections and labeling.
Let's talk about the safety of this a bit. There may be some presumption by listeners that given that this process sounds different, that it is inherently less safe, or it introduces variables that might not exist in other types of manufacturing. Take us through that.
Yeah. So, and they're fair questions around like, what are the risks? And in the U.S., we have a risk-based regulatory system for food. What does that mean? It means that we reasonably try to identify things that may cause harm to humans if they eat something or handle it. And that's why we cook meat up to a certain temperature before we eat it. That's why the government says to do those sorts of things, because those reduce the risk of something, of getting sick from eating our food. We have a very good food regulatory system in the United States, one of the best in the world, if not the best. And so the way that they're regulating this and applying that is to cell-based meat is actually not much different than meat itself. The safety assessment that FDA will do evaluates just the things that go into making it, so the food that the cells that they eat, so to make sure that they're appropriate to be consumed. It evaluates the cells and the tissues themselves to make sure that if you're putting muscle in, you should be getting muscle out. And then, of course, also, did anything hitch a ride alongside the culture? Meaning, like, obviously, if we're culturing them, then other things can grow too. We don't want bacteria growing in the culture system. So our process is aseptic. There's no bacteria in there except for the cells. So we want to prevent all of those things from happening. And this is where actually it is different from conventional animal agriculture, because the moment an animal is slaughtered and it's processed, there's a case of, like, for example, chicken, that there's salmonella that grows within the cells or within the tissues. And then, of course, with like beef, there's E. coli from the intestines when they're slaughtered. Now, the risk is very low overall for meat that we eat every day. For cell-based meat products, we have nothing. Our products are aseptic. There's no bacteria. There's nothing in them that can harm you. What results then, of course, is what the environment that we would process them in could. So the things that are unique, if they are there, have to do with how they're handled by the staff and how they're processed that way. But in terms of the safety itself, what they'll be looking at is very routine things of, did you put in what you said you would? Do you measure it and document it as you said you would? And can you show us those data, please? And again, that's true for any food product on market right now. So for cell-based meat products, we're not expecting anything too different because we don't think our products are that different.
And what about labeling? Do you think consumers would have an argument that they have a right to know on the label that this is a cell-based protein product versus a product that is not? There's a lot we don't know about our food that isn't on a label of just about everything we eat, but there's also things on the label that maybe tell consumers something that is either not helpful or maybe consumers don't understand it anyway. How have the discussions been on cell-based meat?
Yeah, and these are ongoing with our compatriots in our own industry. We formed a coalition called the Alliance for Meat, Poultry, and Seafood Innovation, which is the world's first cell-based meat alliance, and we talk about that, of course. And we have representatives from meat, poultry, and seafood, cell-based companies, as well as with the U.S. government. And I can tell you that this, of course, is and of course our broader stakeholder set. And I can tell you it's a really important conversation with everybody. Everyone cares about labeling. It is probably the most important thing that a consumer will evaluate this product on outside of taste, especially when they're in the grocery store. For us, we think there's value in disclosing the method of production. So we would, of course, commit to like voluntarily disclosing this is a cell-based meat product because we think consumers will want to buy it for that reason. One thing, though, that on the regulatory side that's really important is that you can't intentionally mislead consumers. And so there's an ongoing discussion with regulators and stakeholders of, if we are discussing the sort of composition of our products, if our products are meat, and if they are substantially equivalent to those meat products, like a conventional product and the cell-based are put next to each other, and they are not different nutritionally or the way they cook or the way they handle or again, they're the same or equivalent, then is it misleading to consumers to say that they are different? And so our products are meat. They're regulated by USDA. So at the end of the day, our products are meat. And so that's not in question. What goes in front of it, of course, is how is it produced? And we want to do it in a way that tells consumers something meaningful about our products. In this case, that they are produced in this new way. But it's really still getting the same thing that they've always known and loved.
It sounds like you might have a considerable consumer education and public affairs campaign in need.
You're right, though. This is, again, it is hard for some people to wrap their heads around, and I get it. I'm telling you it's a familiar product, and then I tell you how it's made, and it doesn't jive with what maybe you think of when you think of meat. But for 10,000 years, we have made meat by growing an animal. What if we made meat, the same meat you know and love, just a different way? We've been doing that with every other part of agriculture and food production since its inception. And if there's one industry that embraces innovation, it is agriculture. If there's one industry that is pro technology, pro try to give consumers choice, it is agriculture and the food production industry. And so we see ourselves as a part of that. So part of it is, yes, us telling consumers about it, responding to consumers, but also we need to get it in consumers' hands and allow them to give us feedback. And of course, in order to do that, we need to go through the federal regulatory process. So step one is establish its safety and then go get consumer feedback. But of course, we want to talk to consumers well in advance of that. That said, we've done hundreds of tastings on site in our facility for our products, and the feedback is overwhelmingly positive. That people love our products because they taste like meat. From people who don't eat meat have tried our products to people who are diehard, carnivores like myself, really do see this is meat, and when can I buy it?
How have traditional players in the meat industry responded to the rise in non-meat products and cell-based meat? You might think that they would be a barrier to entry.
We've actually seen a surprisingly positive partnership with the conventional meat industry. We've signed initially, even the regulatory framework we signed in collaboration with the North American Meat Institute, which is the trade association that represents, it's the largest meat food processor org in the United States. We have a lot of common ground with the conventional meat industry because, again, we're all working towards the same goal here, and that's feed a growing number of people the meat that they love and they've always enjoyed. And we see ourselves as another option to help that aid that process. Can't speak to the plant-based industry because we're not in that. And obviously I'm not a conventional meat producer, so I can't really weigh in on what they're thinking, but I can tell you from our experience at Memphis Meats, they've been more or less really supportive of at least getting us to market. Cause they told us, let's get on market safely and we can compete there. And, let's let consumers decide. And I'm fully supportive of that.
So let's talk about, let's fast forward to a day when Memphis Meats products are in every grocery store across the country. Do you see these products sitting just side by side? We talked a little bit about the labeling, and I realize that's still a bit TBD. And you spoke about the importance of consumers having the information they need to make a decision. Do you see this sitting in any different part of a market than where its companion products sit?
Yeah, for Memphis Meats, we look at it as we want to be where meat is already. So if it's ultimately, we'd love to be in retail stores in the meat locker of your grocery store. Initially, though, we get feedback from culinary professionals. Like we want to work with restaurants and get that feedback from people who work in and out with meat every day. And so we're targeting entry with restaurants first in small launches where we can supply routinely and get feedback from not only the consumers, but also the chefs that are working with them every day in, day out so that we can improve it. The unique part of this is that if we want to make a change to the product, it's not like we have to wait 1.5 years to breed an animal and then slaughter to see if it worked. We can go back and, in a few weeks, we have a new product that has been optimized for a particular chef's preferences or restaurant. So the goal, though, is ultimately be anywhere you can buy meat at retail level, and it costs parity or cheaper. But initially, we'll probably enter in with restaurants.
You hit on something I hadn't thought of, but where does the flavor? I mean, do the cells ultimately develop the characteristics of the product more so than kind of the environment and what you do to the cells? I mean, I'm putting now my chef's hat on, and so you bring a piece of meat, I taste it, and I give you feedback that says this is great, but the next time you bring me something, I'd love for it to have a little bit more of this, a little bit more of that. You're telling me that 2 weeks later, you could bring me that new customized piece of meat that might meet exactly what I'm looking for my restaurant?
Yes, that's what we're targeting, is this notion that the cells themselves do the heavy lifting for us. So as you know, in an animal, we've bred animals to taste and have their muscle taste the way we want it to taste, or to have the cooking characteristics that we prefer. We have this concept of what we call cellular domestication. The idea that when the cells that we're growing and producing into meat food products can do a lot of that work for us, that we can change what we're feeding them, their fatty acid profile, their amino acid profile, and those propagate through the system and produce a product that can have a different flavor profile, or cook differently, or smell differently. The base of this is great genetics, though. You can't get around the fact that you need a good animal with great genes in order to start this process. So I don't want to short shrift the animal that we get it from. But let's say we want that beef to taste more beefy. Well, then we might dial in a couple of different fatty acids that when they cook, they smell and taste and release a much more umami-like flavor. Or we have, the glutamic acid that's inside of the cells, which is what gives you that sense of umami, is also increased, for example, and maybe it adds to this increased beefiness, if that makes any sense. So the short answer is yes. We ask the cells to do that lifting by asking them, by feeding them a different diet, for example. And then 2 weeks later, we have a different product that can be customized as well. So instead of having to wait for the animal to grow, we can just ask the cells to do it.
Given how much knowledge and experience you've got in food, and you're seeing a product like this developed, when you're eating, is your mind just going a million miles an hour with every little tiny attribute of what you're eating? I mean, you specifically. I know I think a lot about food. I cook a lot. Food is such an amazing part of culture. But like, what's inside your brain when you're eating with all that other information you've got about food?
For me,
or is it just damn, this is good?
For me specifically, I approach food, and maybe this is why Uma hired me, boy, there's so much I don't know. Like, I want to know what made this Angus beef so good. Like, how did we get here? And where's it going to go? How can I take meat to where it could be? Of course, when I'm eating a hamburger, a cheeseburger, we're currently, when this is being recorded, in lockdown during a pandemic. I want to go to Shake Shack and eat Shake Shack, and I'm not thinking about anything other than the pleasure it provides me at that moment. And I think to some extent that is like the ideal outcome when you are eating a product like that, right? And that's how I think about food. Heck, for my own wedding, at the reception meal, we served Taco Bell. So I am not above having, I want delicious food, and I want it to taste good in that moment. For consumers, I think there's a spectrum, as you're saying. You could be thinking about all the ways you could improve it. And sometimes you just want it to taste good. And I'm here for all of it.
Here for all of it. Let's leave it there. Thanks for tuning in to another episode of HPS Insights. Many thanks to our guest, Eric Schulze of Memphis Meats. You can learn more about Memphis Meats online at memphismeats.com. You can find out more about Hamilton Place Strategies' work and our podcasts at www.hamiltonplacestrategies.com, or by following us on Twitter at HPS Insight. I'm your host this week, Tucker Warren, and as always, thanks for listening to HPS Insights.
Thank you for listening to the HPS Insights podcast, produced by Hamilton Place Strategies. For the latest updates, follow us on Twitter at HPS Insight and visit us on the web at hamiltonplacestrategies.com.